Okay, good afternoon all. My name is Jeff Freeman. I work with EEI and I'm happy to be part of the consulting team for the City of Joliet's Alternative Water Source Program. Today we are talking about stakeholder meeting number 3. It's yet again a virtual stakeholder meeting for obvious reasons. We appreciate everybody taking the time. We do have an hour and a half reserved, a portion of that set up for Q&A at the end overall, but we have a good discussion, or the presenters have a good presentation for you, and we're excited to pass this information on. Today, again, my name is Jeff Freeman and I am the moderator. Our panelists of presenters, I will actually be doing some of the presentation as well today, but we have Allison Swisher from the City of Joliet who will give us the update, and then Joe Johnson's going to be presenting on Lake Michigan allocation information, and Teresa will be presenting on Lake Michigan as well. Our more formal agenda is in a few minutes, but before we get to that, I just want to reiterate that this is meant to be a collaborative discussion, going back and forth between folks, or if for you to add questions, and at the end, having the panelists provide responses to them for those questions that certainly we can answer today. We will. For those that might require a little bit more research, then we can reach out to those individuals later on. Please recall that in the webinar function, the preference is to put your questions in the Q&A panel, not in the chat panel. If you take your cursor over top of the toolbar for the Zoom, you'll find the Q&A button. If you touch that button, then the panel will come up, and simply type your question into that panel, and then we as panelists, moderator, will be able to view them. And again, with the plan to address them verbally at the end of the webinar or independently if it requires some additional review. The formal agenda for today's discussion, following my introduction, then Allison's going to give the water source program update. Next, then she's going to talk about the regional water system planning and outreach that has been occurring over the last few months. I'll be talking about water conservation and non-revenue water reduction for the city. Then Joe will be talking about the Lake Michigan allocation program overall, and then Teresa will get into the specifics of that allocation program for the City of Joliet, with the application being filed last week. And then at the end, we again have about 20 minutes reserved for Q&A, so please submit your questions as we go along so that we can amass those, and then at the end address them. So with those opening remarks, we can have Allison as first up, and she's going to talk to us about an update on the Alternative Water Source Program.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. Again, my name is Allison Swisher. I'm the Director of Public Utilities for the City of Joliet. And welcome to our third stakeholder meeting of the year. I think we've found that these have been very useful meetings and a good way to keep all of our stakeholders on this very important project updated. So I'm happy today to have the opportunity to provide an update on the city's alternative water source program. And then as Jeff mentioned, once I'm done giving that update, I'll talk in more detail about the regional water planning efforts that have been underway. So if you've participated in these meetings previously, you've already have seen the next few slides. However, for any newcomers, we recognize it's important that we provide a brief summary of why Joliet is switching water sources, and just inform you of the work that's been completed to date. So our current problem is that our existing water source, which is the deep sandstone aquifer, is not going to be able to meet maximum day demands by 2030. This was determined by groundwater modeling that was completed by the Illinois State Water Survey in the fall of 2018, and then that was recently updated in the spring of 2020, which confirmed what was previously identified as that 2030 deadline. So in order to address that issue, the city embarked on a two-phased study of available alternative water sources that began in 2018 with an evaluation of all possible water source options. That was 14 different alternatives that were evaluated for water quality and water quantity. 5 water sources then were passed forward into the phase 2 study for a much deeper evaluation into those alternatives. And those alternatives are listed on the screen: the Illinois River, the Kankakee River, and then 3 variations on Lake Michigan water. It's important to note that ever since the kind of beginning of this study, we've always been evaluating these water sources as not only a alternative water source for Joliet, but also the region. So then those phase 2 study results were presented to the Joliet City Council in the fall of 2019. In January of this year, the city did select Lake Michigan as the most reliable and sustainable water source for, again, not only Joliet, but potentially the region as well. The City Council did task the project team with a simultaneous investigation of 2 of the Lake Michigan alternatives, those being the new Indiana intake and purchasing water from the Chicago Department of Water Management. So the city is very excited to be bringing Lake Michigan water to the residents of Joliet. Lake Michigan is an asset to the entire region that will provide a reliable and sustainable water supply for years to come. There's many benefits of Lake Michigan water that are listed here on the screen, and we've been talking about these throughout the past year. But we do see this as, you know, the water source being really the gold standard for drinking water in northeastern Illinois, and are going to be able to provide that reliable and sustainable source for the city of Joliet. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the 2 alternatives that are being evaluated further during 2020. The first is obtaining Lake Michigan water through a new intake in Indiana. This option presents the information that was presented during the phase 2 study. And again, it's very conceptual at this point, but really the goal of 2020 has been further evaluating these options and then presenting, you know, updated information about costs and risks associated with them. So for the new Indiana intake option, there would be a new intake in northwestern Indiana. The raw water would then be pumped in transmission main, about 47 miles of transmission main, to a water treatment plant that would be located on somewhere in the eastern side of Joliet. From there, then the treated water would be distributed throughout a distribution network to the city's customers. This option, again, capital cost ranges from $900 million to $1.1 billion. That depends on whether the system's constructed for Joliet alone or Joliet plus regional partners. The typical bill increase ranges from $68 to about $56, and again, it depends on if it's the system is for Joliet only or the region. And just for a point of reference, the current water bill, and this is water only, not including sewer or trash, in Joliet is about $30 a month. We also looked at the total cost of water. How much will the city spend over the next 50 years for all components of the water program? And that ranges from $3.9 billion to $5.4 billion. So for this option, the city does have a greater or complete control over then rate setting and implementation. However, there's greater complexity due to the larger amount of infrastructure that has to be constructed and crossing state lines. However, there is a lower 50-year total cost in comparison to the purchased water option. So for the Chicago option, as shown on the screen, again, this is the conceptual plan that was presented in the phase 2 study, which is currently being updated. We'll be connecting to the existing Southwest pumping station, constructing 30 miles of transmission main for finished water, and then that finished water will be conveyed throughout the distribution system in Joliet. The capital cost for this option is lower. It's $550 million to $650 million. And the typical water bill increase ranges from $61, about $52, which is less than the Indiana option initially. However, you do see that the 50-year total cost is higher with the purchased water option. However, this is less complex an option because of it's an existing system that we would be connecting onto. So the very high level program schedule is that in 2020, we are working towards evaluating those two alternatives further. We are going to be presenting the 2020 evaluation to the City Council in November, and then looking for the City Council to make a decision in December. After that decision's made, we'll move into preliminary design in 2021, and then final design 2022 to 2024, with the construction time period being 2025 to 2030. And we are confident that with either alternative, the new water supply will be online and Joliet residents will have Lake Michigan water available at their taps by 2030. So there's been a lot of work going on behind the scenes this summer to complete the technical evaluation. So there's a lot of items on the screen related to that. In August, we did have the second City Council workshop, which presented the team's recommendations to the Council for Regional Governance, water treatment technology, and then also transmission main routing. So the City Council did concur with staff recommendations on those three items. And if you missed the workshop, the video is available on the Rethink Water Joliet website. In September, we've had ongoing meetings with the water supply and water access partners. There's also ongoing technical work related to the level 2 transmission main routing study. And we also did achieve a very important milestone on September 22nd, which is when we submitted our Lake Michigan allocation application to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And Teresa is going to discuss that application in more detail later on in the meeting. So next month, we're going to basically be wrapping up the 2020 evaluation and pulling all the information together into the final documents. Those are the basis of design and the prospectus documents. Those will be presented and really will be the evaluation of the two alternatives. It'll provide updated cost estimates, identify risks for each alternative, as well as options to mitigate those risks. So we feel that with that information, the City Council will be able to have all the information available to make the decision on the final alternative. So as I mentioned previously, the 2020 evaluation will be presented to the City Council in November at a workshop. That date will be made available in the next couple of weeks. Then in December, we are looking to host a public forum. This will be the public and other stakeholders' opportunity to learn the results of the 2020 evaluation and provide feedback. And we are currently exploring options for formats for the public forum so that we are able to engage as many stakeholders as possible given the restrictions in place due to COVID. So it is anticipated, and we are on track for the City Council to make the final selection later that month in December. And then after that selection, we'll move forward with preliminary design in January. So as we always, kind of conclude this section, I do want to make sure everyone is getting involved in the program. We've had a lot of new stakeholders sign up to be on our stakeholder list. And if you do that, you do automatically then receive our monthly newsletter, and then also get e-blasts and other information about project meetings. So please encourage your neighbors and anyone else you believe might be interested in this program to sign up at our website, which is www.rethinkwaterjoliet.org. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the next agenda item, which is regional water system planning. And One of the items that was discussed in great detail at the City Council workshop in August was governance of a regional water system. Today, I'm going to provide a high-level overview of regional water system planning and the approach to governance that was recommended and then accepted by the City Council. So in the Chicagoland area, we are fortunate to have multiple water source options. So this map shows the main water sources for municipalities in the Chicago region. You can see the Lake Michigan service area in light blue, and then the orange and yellow areas show where groundwater is being used, with orange representing the communities using the deep sandstone aquifer. This area circled in blue is just the region that we've been focusing on in the southwest suburbs. So as you can see, the deep sandstone aquifer is a very important source of water in the southwestern suburbs. There's about 30 million gallons per day that's being currently pumped from the aquifer in this area to serve not only municipal customers, but also industry. So our current best estimate is that this is at least 10 times the amount that the sandstone aquifers can sustainably handle. And this is especially an issue in Will County. So as a result, the water levels in the deep aquifer have been declining for over a century. And that was the slide I showed earlier, with stating what the current problem is. So zooming into the southwest suburbs, you can see more specifically where communities surrounding Joliet get their water from currently. It's really important to understand this when you begin to think about regional water planning. So again, the blue is Lake Michigan, orange is the deep aquifer, and then yellow is shallow aquifer. So not every community in the region faces the same issues that Joliet and our other communities that use the deep aquifer do, but there's issues with every water source potentially. So there's definitely been a lot of interest in this area for a regional water system. So regional water planning is not a new concept in the Chicagoland area. Many regional water supplies have formed over the years to take advantage of the benefits of regionalization. So these benefits typically include cost savings to the customer due to the economies of scale. So again, this exhibit is just showing the network of commissions that currently exist and their customers. So in the southwest suburbs, regional water systems have been discussed for many years, going back to the 1960s. However, none of the regional systems have actually developed into systems that are currently providing water. So to really start that conversation again, Joliet spearheaded the formation of the Southwest Water Planning Group. This group is made up of 13 communities and 3 industries. And it was initially formed to fund a 3-year study by the Illinois State Water Survey to update both their shallow and deep aquifer groundwater models. And those updated models are very important, not only for Joliet, but all of the communities in the region to understand the risks associated with their existing water supply. And as I mentioned previously, there's risk not only to the deep aquifer, but also to the shallow aquifer. So this group does meet monthly, and it discusses regional water supply planning issues and topics. So the results of the State Water Survey modeling efforts are shown on this screen. And as the exhibit shows, the unsustainability of the deep aquifer is a regional problem, not just a Joliet problem. So Joliet switching off the aquifer in 2030 does not solve the problem for the region. You can see that by 2050, the deep aquifer is still very much at risk. So since this is a regional problem, there is an opportunity for a regional solution. And this slide shows the communities surrounding Joliet that we have been talking to for about the past year about the possibly partnering with the city on a regional water system. So development of a regional water system has thus far consisted of two components. The first component is regional outreach. And this past summer, myself and members of the project team have met with potential regional community participants on a one-on-one basis to really understand their interest level in participating in a regional water system, as well as trying to understand their preferences related to the two Lake Michigan alternatives being evaluated, and then also their preferences related to how the water system would be governed, whether that would be more of a commission format or a format where Joliet would sell water to them as a wholesale customer. So the majority of the communities that we met with expressed that they would prefer that a commission be formed. We also asked then if potential partners had a preference for one of the alternatives being evaluated, and from that discussion, there was not a strong preference for either the purchased water from Chicago or the Indiana alternative. So that outreach was conducted this summer, and we are continuing to have continuing conversations with potential partners. The second component of the development of the regional water system was the governance evaluation. This was prepared by Joliet's special legal counsel, Barbara Adams, with Donahue and Rose. And she investigated the water system governance structures that are currently available by state statutes and their advantages and disadvantages. So these are the major types of regional governance structures that were evaluated. Each of them is, slightly different from the others, and there's key features that, have those differences, such as how the water entity is created, governing bodies and voting, how you would add or withdraw members, and so on. So there's many options that currently exist under current state statutes, and each of them is slightly different. So after talking with the potential regional partners and then also considering the evaluation conducted by our legal counsel, it was recommended by the project team that a water commission format be utilized. However, we did recognize that there would be certain modifications that would be required, and those were mostly based upon the need to have proportional voting. That proportional voting would be based upon the financial commitments made by each member. The City Council did concur with this recommendation, and there were many benefits to the formation of a regional water commission. As stated previously, there's lower rates due to cost sharing and economies of scale. The phase 2 study estimated this could be approximately $10 per month with a 60 MGD regional water system. The water commission format would then distribute risks amongst more entities. In our discussions with state and federal agencies, we understand that there is support for regionalization, and we think that in power in numbers, we will have more ability to seek out and obtain the support of state and federal legislators. The water commission format also does have the ability then to obtain access for construction and rights of ways outside of the limits of City of Joliet, which will make the construction of the project much more feasible. So again, this was presented to the City Council at the workshop on the 25th, and the Council did concur with the recommendation to move forward. So the next steps are we need to continue discussions with potential regional communities. This is very much just the beginning of the process. There are many details that still need to be determined, and these details will be discussed and agreed upon by the potential members of the commission. So this just identifies some of the details that would still need to be worked out and discussed. And then the timeline for forming the new commission is provided here. Much of this is dependent upon the City Council's selection of the final water source alternative. Once that is done, then we can move forward with developing the rate structure and final governance details for the Water Commission based on that selected water source alternative. As mentioned previously, there would need to be a legislative process to amend the current Water Commission statutes to address those modifications previously mentioned related to commission board makeup as well as proportional voting. Those legislative changes would not impact existing commissions, but would be written such that it would be a modification for the Water Commission that would be formed to serve this area. And then finally, we would then look to have final commitments by regional partners next fall, and then move forward with formally establishing the commission via resolution, and then approving water purchase and sale agreements. So that concludes my presentation on regional water systems, and I will now turn it back to Jeff, who's going to talk about water conservation.
Great, thank you, Allison. Good overview as always. At this point, you're probably able to recite that even when you're not trying. And the regionalization discussion, I'm sure, was a benefit to everybody as well. So now I'm going to talk about water conservation. As Allison stated, the city of Joliet is certainly committed to water conservation, and through their efforts, certainly over the last few years, have shown that they see the benefits of it, and certainly want to share their thoughts with the rest of the region, so that as a region as a whole, not only within the city, but within the region as a whole, everybody would have a similar level of water conservation. Why does it make sense to conserve water? Well, clearly, water, especially fresh water, is a scarce resource, and we need to use it wisely. By reducing, water withdrawals overall, and maintaining, sustainability throughout aquifers, surface waters, etc., it's definitely less of an impact on the environment. The goal, of course, is zero net impact. So by conserving water, we certainly get closer to that. It saves energy to produce water. Drinking water, requires, even a little bit amount of production of water requires a little bit amount of energy, and therefore, by using less, you can save energy overall and decrease the environmental footprint related to that. And lastly, and often to some or most, is it saves money. Through water conservation, you can reduce the size of facilities that are needed for a given population, and or the size of facilities can remain in place for longer, and therefore you don't have to pay to expand them, which the chart on the right is a modification from an AWWA M52 manual that shows graphically how that's accomplished. Again, less water use means smaller facilities, and ultimately could delay the need to expand systems in the future. The Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning had done a Water 2050 plan for Northeast Illinois region. And within that, one of the main approaches to have sustainable water supply for Northeastern Illinois was demand management and essentially water conservation. There was 13 water conservation best management practices that were identified as part of Water 2050, which the region, continues to look to, and certainly the city of Joliet does as well. All 13 of those best practices, best management practices, are listed here, some of which the city has already been able to accomplish and move forward, others of which they continue to look to continue to improve their overall water conservation within the community. Some specific items that the city has undertaken relative to water conservation. If you did not know, the city council had set up essentially an environmental commission. The environmental commission was monitoring the progress of this throughout the planning. And then within the environmental commission, there was a water conservation subcommittee, which continues to meet every month on the second Wednesday of the month. Actually, I'm sorry, it's the first Wednesday of the month at the City Hall. So for those that are interested, Right now, it's scheduled for 3:30 p.m. on the first Wednesdays of the month. Some of the items that committee has been able to accomplish is through incentivizing with rain barrel subsidies. So residents can essentially purchase a rain barrel at a subsidized rate. And then also there's a rebate program for low flow toilet replacement. So throughout town, if you have a higher flush toilet greater than the 1.6 gallons per flush, then you can replace that toilet and get a rebate from the city for doing that. Currently, the city or the subcommittee is working on empowering the community through a restaurant initiative, which basically it's requesting that restaurants who typically might give out water when people enter the establishment or sit down at their table to kind of think that through, because in a lot of instances perhaps folks don't need or want that water. So just reaching out to see if restaurants can be a little more judicious about passing out that water. Educate is certainly a huge part of the overall program through just outreach in general to the public, but specifically the Water Conservation Subcommittee has also initiated discussions with local school districts to try to get water conservation into the curriculum throughout the community, because our youngsters will often do a nice job of grabbing on to things like this, and then they'll teach us older folks better ways to do things. And then lastly, motivate. So continue to provide that information out to the public so that they continue to see the benefit by providing all kinds of information. It's in the newsletter very often, as well as on billboards throughout the community, and certainly other media that the city is putting out. As part of this, like mentioned, the goal is not only to accomplish water conservation within the corporate boundaries, but on a regional level as well. In some instances, the city is able to partner with folks such as Will County to extend their reach and reach out into the larger community overall. Also, there's a lot of outreach through social media, because that certainly is easy to pass on. And then even on the PACE buses is their advertising. Recently, the city became a Water Sense partner, which is a program run by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, showing that they are an ambassador that promotes the value of Water Sense. With that, they are also able to get information from the program and be able to push that out to the community. Another organization that the logo is shown on here is Alliance for Water Efficiency, and the city is members with that organization, which gets them access to a lot of information as well. Some specific items that the city is taking care of from a code perspective is the 4 codes that are listed on this slide. So on August 18th, the City Council reviewed the revisions to each one of these code sections and approved them. A lot of them were or are requirements as part of the allocation process for Lake Michigan. It's not a requirement to actually get the allocation necessarily, but it is something that has to be put in place. The city has been very proactive in essentially taking care of that before they even move forward with the allocation submittal. So how can we get this information down, or what specifically can a resident do to conserve water? Again, a lot of this information has already been out there to the public. It's shared in newsletters and other ways. Take advantage. We want the residents to take advantage of those programs that are already there with the rain barrel subsidy and the low flow toilet rebate. Some more day-to-day items is, make sure that you turn off the tap while brushing your teeth. Your kids do as well. May seem like not much water, but when you add that up, 365 days a year times 2, typically with 2 brushes a day, then that certainly can add up even within a singular household and across the community. If you're working on your dishes within the sink, scrubbing away prior to loading into the dishwasher or ultimately washing it, the key is not to just let that water run, let the sink fill up. Obviously, try to get your laundry and your dishwasher full before running those full loads. And then shorter showers are certainly a way to save a significant amount of money. One last item that I think I forgot to put on here was outdoor water use, being smart about your outdoor water use. Lawns typically only require about 1.5 inches of water per week. So there's no need to water beyond that. If it rains, take that into account if you do in fact irrigate. And then if you do irrigate, certainly just want to irrigate the lawns and be smart about how you're putting sprinklers out and limit the amount that gets on pavement or sidewalks. Okay, from water conservation, we go into non-revenue water reduction. The city has, certainly turned up their approach to go after non-revenue water for very good reason. And we just wanted to talk today about some of the work items or approaches that the city has taken. Before we get into those specifics, just a quick overview of non-revenue water. Well, first of all, the city's current supply is groundwater, so they pump that water out of the ground, they put it through their water treatment plant. If you take the point where the water comes out of that water treatment plant and then heads into the waterworks system and then ultimately gets to the customer's tap, for that water that basically comes out of the production facility and then is either not measured at the tap or not billed, that's considered non-revenue water, because as a full enterprise fund within the water system, you certainly need to recover the revenue to be able to pay for providing that service to the community. Water loss is not unavoidable. I mean, to get down to zero as far as water loss is not physically possible, especially with the system the size of Joliet, but it's not economically possible either. So it's trying to find that balance to where is a reasonable amount, with all the considerations overall. The non-revenue water, I already explained and gave that definition overall. So lastly, I guess at the end, or last bullet here is, keep in mind that some portions of non-revenue water just have to be, not only because there'll be some leaks that occur within the distribution system, but there's other things that just simply don't flow through meters, such as the city, when a fire breaks out, that's something that's needed for the community, certainly, and that's one of the uses of the water distribution system. Also, flushing needs to occur for water quality reasons within the distribution system to maintain a high level of water quality and not let things build up in the system. And while again, that's non-revenue water, it's needed. And then in some cases within city municipal buildings, it may not be metered because ultimately they're not going to be able to build themselves. However, the city has made progress in that regard with heading towards metering every facility so that they're tracking that overall, even if they end up sending a zero bill to that department or building. How big of an issue is water loss? Well, the USGS estimates that about 6 out of every 40 billion gallons of water that's produced in the US is lost or is essentially non-revenue water. So the kind of benchmark there is the average across the United States is around 15%. Why should we be concerned? Some of these we've already addressed, but water is certainly a limited resource. The financial impact we've already went through. Ultimately, we're trying to be efficient as possible, keep costs down overall, be good stewards of the environment. In some cases, it's a regulatory requirement, and specifically for the city of Joliet, and or when they connect to Lake Michigan, the regulatory requirement is to get down to 10% non-revenue water. And then, the public, I think, expects it. The public expects us not to waste water. Uh, Again, I'm sure there's awareness that to some degree there will need to be some level of non-revenue water, but trying to minimize that based on the economics is what the public would expect. So as a city, moved into this, they took what I would say is the typical approach, and it follows along with this overall flow chart and continue to kind of work their way through it. And really, it goes more towards the bottom, then you start over again, even on an annual basis, with the overall goal of reducing water loss. So performing a water audit is the starting point. The American Water Works Association has free software that's utilized to help communities do it, an overall water audit to characterize where water is used, where it's metered, where it's not metered, where it's lost, and then after putting it into the different buckets, then you can establish ultimately those goals to go after reducing it. There are a decent amount of performance indicators out there, or at least data to support performance indicators so that the city can compare themselves to other. And then, at the end here, certainly after the goals are set, then you have to integrate those strategies into the budget, set aside a certain amount of revenue to be able to go after the water loss and, again, find that economic balance. In general, there's, the non-revenue water that we've been talking about, but there's the revenue water. So the production splits it up. As noted, the one main thing I guess I wanted to focus in on this slide is within the non-revenue water and the different buckets, a couple of the main ones that would be focused on to reduce that non-revenue is the real losses, which the real losses are really those physical losses that occur within the system, whether it be leakage, just to fitting degrading, whether it be water main breaks throughout the system. The other main component is apparent losses, and apparent losses would be your paper losses, more if a meter is not reading accurately, or if the transfer of data from the metering system to the accounting system to the bills is not 100% where you want it to be. That would be an apparent loss as well. By dividing the non-revenue water into, again, those buckets, then in seeing how big they are or how much of the water loss is associated with either real or apparent, then you can set up strategies to go after each one of them. So just to reiterate or to go through a couple of the generalized real loss and apparent loss strategies. If you take the real losses and if you assume that all of the real losses fit inside of this box, so 100% of the real losses within that water system fit into this box, a portion of it, like I've already mentioned, is unavoidable. It's just impossible with the size of a system by Joliet to make sure that every leak is buttoned up. The goal is certainly to continue to find them and fix them, but the reality is, you can't continuously monitor the leaks within the system to be 100% accurate in that regard. So you have a point of where you can't, achieve, and then somewhere in between is that economic level of real loss, and finding that equilibrium is key. So how do you accomplish that, or what do you do to go after the real losses? Well, in general, you try to get to repairs quickly. So if there's a water main break, trying to get there in some cases days or certainly hours in advance can save a fair amount of water. Managing the pressure throughout the water system, higher pressures through a leak will result in higher amounts of water loss. Therefore, if there are areas where you can reduce the pressure to reduce the amount of leakage, you can save water. Active leakage control through continuing to do leak detection, which the city does do on a regular basis. And then being smart about asset management within the pipelines and water mains throughout the community. So identifying which mains are breaking the most. The city looked at the historical perspective, and actually it's not the oldest mains that end up breaking. It's the mains that are post-World War II that do. So taking the money that's budgeted to go after those areas of town will actually reduce your real losses quicker. So same thought process on the apparent loss side. If we take all the apparent losses within this box, there's going to be a point where you just simply cannot achieve more apparent loss reduction, and then there's the economic level. So ways to reduce apparent losses are, it seems like computers never make errors, and really usually it's probably just how things are programmed into it. But to make sure through the accounting system and through the process of billing and meter transfer that everything is in order there, or as close to it as possible. There is some human error that occurs, just like every process, but trying to reduce that down to near zero is the ideal. reduction of the meter errors. Meters certainly cost money to put throughout the system, and they have a lifespan. And as they get closer to that lifespan, if they come out of the typical accuracy range, then there could be some major errors within that meter. So continuing to monitor that and replace meters as appropriate. And then in some cases, unfortunately, there is theft in the water system if people access the system through fire hydrants, especially, or other unmetered areas. Setting up policies to reduce or essentially try to eliminate that as the overall approach. Some more benefits just to talk about water loss control. It reduces those operational costs. Not unlike, say, even the water conservation component. Lower non-revenue water or lower water loss would be reduction in energy costs. If you're purchasing water from a wholesaler, by reducing the amount of water loss, it's less water that you have to purchase, and then it's less water that you might have to treat. So if you're supplementally treating that water, chemicals, and then all the labor and other that go into providing that. Lost opportunity costs, a lot related there to capacity of the system or lost ability to serve other areas or larger areas. The goal, like any type of program, is to maximize or increase the revenue so that ultimately the rates can remain lower throughout the system. And then, like we had mentioned earlier on water conservation, with reducing water loss, will allow a higher level of capacity or to be able to meet more demands by having that water that's able to provide it to the users. City has done a lot. The first audit was completed first detailed audit was completed in 2016. They did have other methods prior to 2016. And since that time, they've developed strategies and implemented a lot of them, which are listed on this overall slide. So water loss champion has been identified. She works with her water loss task force on typically a monthly basis to get all departments involved throughout the city that may have something related to water, from the fire department, from public works, from the billing department. Overall, getting those heads together to reduce the overall water loss and non-revenue water. Meter testing has been important, and like I mentioned, the leak detection, which is currently, or it moved to biennial leak detection to further reduce water loss. Another list, it just continues, I guess, as far as the efforts that the city has been taking. They have also set up some additional goals, but these are what has been accomplished so far with minimizing unmetered construction. So when a house, for instance, is under construction, there had been a period of time when water was allowed to be used on site and unmetered. Now, as part of the overall process, a meter has to be installed when that water service is going to go in service. The water main replacement program, the city has been investing approximately $10 million per year on water main replacement to go after those real losses, and is planning to increase that to as much as $16 million per year to further reduce the overall water loss. And then the other items there was census analytics and moving forward on testing residential water meters. So with the water audit 16, 17, 18, after that, then the city developed the non-revenue water reduction plan, and then through some updates, with the water audit in 2019, came up with additional strategies for apparent loss and real loss. That would be another nice list. No need probably to go through it. A lot of them are redundant with what has previously been done and just improving upon that. The overall goal is to get the non-revenue water to less than 10% by 2040. So recall that the 10% marker is the regulatory requirement from the IDNR. The city recognizes that they do have some work to do with non-revenue water being around 30%, but setting up with this non-revenue water reduction plan, the work that they've already done, the work they plan to do, and the amount of budgeted dollar amount to the water main replacement program, we are confident that they will be able to get to less than 10% by 2040. This is just a simple graph and last slide here for my portion of the presentation to show how this lays out between the real losses and the apparent losses. So the green is the real losses. Recall that 2040 is the target time frame, and then recall that there just simply is unavoidable real losses. So we want to get as close to that as possible, which ends up being actually very close or just under the 10% for the city of Joliet's system. So with that, they are proposing to replace 1.6% of their water main, which means that all of the water main, if they continue to invest at this amount, will be replaced within 60 to 70 year design life, which is certainly better than the typical design life that you might be achieved these days. But like I said, there's portions of their system that unfortunately the water main would not last that long, just like there is for any older system within northeastern Illinois. So with that, I do see that there was one question that was put in to the Q&A box. I asked that other people continue to add that. We're taking those and we'll account for them or respond to them at the end of the webinar. We're now going to move into Joe Johnson's portion of the presentation.
Great, Jeff. Thanks so much. Over the course of the presentation, we've heard a number of times the term Lake Michigan allocation. So I want to take just a few minutes today to review with everybody what that allocation program involves, why it exists, and why it's important for Joliet. And then Teresa O'Grady will pick up and talk specifically about the efforts that Joliet is making to get that allocation in place. So one of the things that's important in northeastern Illinois is that we have access to this tremendous source of high quality raw water known as Lake Michigan. But what is maybe not commonly known to most people, and here you'll get a little bit of your geography lesson for the day, is that most of Illinois is not located within the Great Lakes Basin. So the map that you're seeing on the screen right now shows the 5 Great Lakes and the areas that are naturally tributary to them. So runoff from rainfall that occurs in these colored areas drains into each of the Great Lakes. If you look down at Illinois, you realize that most of the state of Illinois is not in the Great Lakes Basin, and certainly Joliet is outside of that basin. So so this is important because the historic law governing water in the United States frowns upon what we call interbasin transfers, where water is moved from one basin to another. And so that has to be managed and controlled. Well, those of us who, again, have been around the Chicago area have heard about the reversal of the Chicago River. So back about 120 years ago now, because of issues with water quality and epidemics that were posing a real threat to public health, a decision was made to reverse the Chicago River in this area and take water that historically had flowed into Lake Michigan and divert it away from the lake. And if you look at these maps on this chart, kind of shows you why that was important. The map on the left shows the state of the drainage patterns prior to diversion of the river. So the Chicago River flowed from north to south through the city and then out into Lake Michigan. And the Calumet River similarly came out of northwest Indiana, flowed into Lake Michigan. At that point in time, wastewater treatment processes were fairly limited. So waste discharges, sewer overflows were going into those waterways, and that contaminated water was draining out into the lake, which also served as the source of drinking water for communities up and down the area, but particularly in the city of Chicago. Recognizing that was not a good idea and was causing, as we indicated, public health problems, a major project was implemented to build the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, and then later in time, what's called the Cal-Sag Channel, which allowed water that flowed in the Chicago River and the Calumet River to be diverted away from Lake Michigan into a channel that eventually flows into the Des Plaines River and then subsequently into the Great Lakes Basin. So this is, when you hear about the diversion, the reversal of the Chicago River, it means that we're basically taking water that historically flowed into the lake and diverting it away from the lake, so it's not reaching its original source. As you can imagine, with a change of that magnitude, that prompted lots of discussion, lots of interaction, and quite honestly, legal action. When Illinois implemented the diversion, while it was very important to Chicago and protecting the public health of the community, there were other states that didn't see it that way. Obviously, people downstream on the Mississippi River were very concerned about the fact that Illinois was now sending its wastewater their direction and not dealing with it locally and putting it back into Lake Michigan. There were a series of legal interactions through the first part of the 1900s. Finally, in 1967, a case reached the Supreme Court of the United States, and a consent decree was issued that established a limit of 3,200 cubic feet per second for Illinois' diversion. So that's the amount of water that Illinois can divert out of the Great Lakes Basin and use for other purposes. That initial Supreme Court consent decree was modified in 1980 to provide some better accounting procedures to track compliance on a 40-year running average. And about that same time, the first allocations were granted to communities in northeastern Illinois that use Lake Michigan water. More recently, another note that's important to be aware of, there was increasing concern about the potential for further diversion of water out of the Great Lakes to meet water demands throughout the United States. The Great Lakes states and two of the provinces in Canada got together and began working and formulated what's known as the Great Lakes Compact. The formal name is the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin Sustainable Water Agreement. But that compact defines rules and a framework for managing diversions out of the Great Lakes to make sure that they're properly handled. The compact was adopted and passed into US law in 2008. So an important fact relates to the compact in Illinois. Because Illinois has its own diversion program that's been in place since the 1980s to regulate and monitor the diversion of water out of the Great Lakes Basin, it is exempted from the specific requirements of the Great Lakes Compact. The state of Illinois is an active participant in the overall Great Lakes region, working with the other states to make sure that Great Lakes water is managed effectively. But in terms of the specific rules that govern diversions from the Great Lakes, in Illinois, it is the rules under the Illinois program that was defined by the Supreme Court decree, and not specifically the requirements of the Great Lakes Compact. What does that mean for Joliet? Well, over the past couple of years, we've had extensive discussions with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, who manages the Illinois Diversion Program, as well as with their counterparts in Indiana. And those agencies have confirmed for us that an allocation permit that would be granted to Joliet under Illinois' program would be governed by the Illinois program, and those are the requirements that would have to be met. So Teresa will talk a little bit more in a few minutes about some of the details of how Joliet does that and what that application looks like. So a little bit more about the water allocation program itself. What does it really mean when we talk about Illinois' water allocation program? As I indicated, the program came out of the legal decisions surrounding the diversion of water from the Great Lakes. The Level of Lake Michigan Act was passed in Illinois that established the program. And then the rules that define how that allocation program is going to be managed are codified in the Illinois Administrative Code. Part 3730 has all the details of the rules governing applications and management of allocations. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources and their Office of Water Resources is responsible for managing the allocation program and issuing permits for allocations, as well as monitoring the progress and how those allocations are being used. But the final accounting related to the Illinois diversion is actually done by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so that's published on an annual basis. They take all of the various data, do the analysis, and actually publish the final information governing or defining how much water Illinois has used and diverted out of the Great Lakes system. some of the specific objectives of Illinois' allocation program, it really is focused on making Lake Michigan water available for domestic water supply in this region. As we've said, and it's been mentioned before, Lake Michigan is a tremendous high-value water source for the region, and the allocation program is structured to try to make that supply available as much as possible within the constraints of Illinois' diversion program. By doing that, the Lake Michigan allocation program serves to preserve the groundwater resources that exist in the area for communities who don't have access to Lake Michigan water. So communities who can use Lake Michigan water in place of groundwater are encouraged to do that, and that leaves the groundwater available for people who have fewer options. The access to a long-term sustainable source of supply has been a key element in the formation of some of the regional systems that Allison talked about earlier, because it provides that long-term sustainability and reliability for these systems so that they can then secure financing to implement what are generally fairly costly regional systems and put them into place. And then the last couple of things, definitely the program is focused on promoting the efficient development of water supplies. How do we use the water resources that we have in this area to best meet the needs of the community? And how do we conserve and manage that resource to make sure that it's being used efficiently and that we are respectful of the privilege that we have to use Lake Michigan water in this area? There are three main components in the water allocation, and so that relates to domestic water supply, which is water that's used for municipal and industrial demands. There is what we call a direct diversion. As you can imagine, there are controlling structures where the Chicago River and the Calumet River meet the Great Lakes or meet Lake Michigan. And as ships lock through the locks at those locations, there is lockage and leakage that goes on. There are other factors that play into that direct diversion related to water quality management. And then there's stormwater runoff. So if you think about it, there is a small sliver of Illinois that at the turn of at the start of the 19th and 20th century, end of the 19th, start of the 20th century, those areas did drain to the lake. Now with the changes to our waterways and the reversal of the river, stormwater runoff that drains into the Chicago River does not go to Lake Michigan, but ends up going down to the Mississippi River Basin. And that accounts for a portion of the diversion that Illinois has to document in its diversion program. What's important about that domestic water supply is relatively stable. While there is some growth in the area and supply changes over time, the historically, or at least in recent years, the growth has been somewhat offset by the implementation of more efficient water fixtures in homes and buildings. The direct diversion is a relatively stable amount of water that can be controlled and managed. Stormwater runoff, on the other hand, is highly variable. It really depends on how much rain we have in a given year, how much runoff there is, and how that fits into the overall diversion accounting. So these are the components that the Corps of Engineers tracks, and they build up when they do their overall diversion accounting. But Joliet's allocation and the allocation for any community using Lake Michigan water would fall under that domestic water supply part of the allocation program. So what's the state of Illinois' diversion? And as I mentioned, one of the big factors that has really happened over the last 20, 25 years now is that the Lake Michigan pumpage, the amount of water that's pumped out of the lake for water supply, has actually decreased significantly by about 300 million gallons a day over that time period. A lot of that is in fact attributable to the efforts of water utilities to reduce their leakage and their losses, as well as the widespread implementation of new plumbing fixtures that use less water. And so as a region, we are certainly doing a very good job of conserving water, being more efficient in how we use that water. That's also indicated when you look at the last few years, the Department of Natural Resources changed their auditing process that they go through every year with each community to better track non-revenue water. And in the time since they've made that change, across the region, non-revenue water has dropped a little bit from about 16% down to about 13%. So we're moving in the right direction. What's important there is to look at the overall diversion program and realized that there is adequate water within Illinois' current limit for diverting water out of the Great Lakes to support the supply of additional Lake Michigan water to water utilities. So there is an opportunity for communities like Joliet to take advantage of this resource and make Lake Michigan water available to their customers. And in addition, Joliet in particular, and other communities in the Joliet region are well suited for an allocation. They're existing groundwater communities, and so switching to Lake Michigan water will reduce that deep aquifer pumpage. And while it won't solve the problem of overpumping of the aquifer all by itself, it will certainly extend the life of the aquifer and make groundwater available for other communities who don't have access to Lake Michigan water. It provides a reliable long-term water supply for the city of Joliet and allows Joliet to formulate a plan around a regional water solution that can serve the area for many, many years to come. And then as Jeff talked about previously, Joliet is committed to conservation and water efficiency efforts. They understand that as a Lake Michigan allocation permittee, they have to work to that goal of reducing their non-revenue water to less than 10% of their pumpage. And that's why there's been such a focus on their program to promote conservation and also reduce non-revenue water. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa O'Grady, and she'll talk a little bit more about Joliet-specific allocation application and how that fits into the overall alternative water supply program.
Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa O'Grady, and I'm with Crawford, Murphy, and Tilley. And Joe just talked to you about the Lake Michigan diversion and water allocation program highlighting the city of Joliet would be covered under the Illinois diversion. So I'm going to continue by discussing the Lake Michigan allocation permit process, and specifically Joliet's Lake Michigan allocation permit application. So we'll get started here and talk about the allocation permit process. In order to use Lake Michigan water in Illinois, you need to obtain a Lake Michigan water allocation permit from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and we're going to talk about that as IDNR. They oversee the use and permitting of Illinois diversions from Lake Michigan, and currently there's 216 water utilities that have IDNR permits for the use of Lake Michigan water in Illinois. And so when we talk about water utilities and being permittees, they include more than what you think. So current permittees include municipal water utilities like City of Chicago, Evanston, Elmhurst, New Lenox, and others that use water for municipal uses. There's also regional water utilities that use water in their treatment process, such as Central Lake County, Jawa. There's quasi-municipal water utilities, such as Glenbrook Sanitary District and other sanitary districts that use Lake Michigan water, as well as private water utilities like Illinois American or Aqua Illinois. And then there's also water utilities at commercial, industrial, and institutions throughout the northern Illinois, such as Loyola University Medical Center, Illinois Beach State Park, and others. So each water allocation permit identifies the water allocation amount expressed as a daily water usage averaged over the course of the year, and this may vary over time, increasing with growth or decreasing with water conservation that Jeff talked about. The allocation also indicates the starting date for the allocation. In the case of Joliet, we're looking at 2030. The duration of the allocation and any conditions required for receipt and maintenance of the allocation. It's important to note that each end user of Lake Michigan water must have its own allocation. If you are a customer of a community, such as a residential, commercial, industrial customer of a municipal water system, then you don't need your own permit. However, if one community water supply sells water to another community water supply as a wholesale customer, who then might sell it as a third to a third community water supply as a wholesale customer, then all 3 of these community water supplies need to obtain a Lake Michigan water allocation permit. So in other words, when we talk about Joliet's application, Joliet is only applying for Lake Michigan water allocation permit for the water required to serve direct customers, not to serve regional partners or wholesale customers. So communities that decide to participate in a regional solution with Joliet as part of the proposed water commission that Allison discussed in her presentation, they will also need to apply for and secure their own Lake Michigan allocation permit. Water utilities can submit an application for Lake Michigan water allocation permit under one of 2 categories. First of all, category 1A includes communities for which Lake Michigan provides the most economical source of supply. We also have category 1B, which includes communities for which the use of Lake Michigan water would reduce regional use of the deep aquifer. For these communities, a Lake Michigan source must be shown to be viable, but does not have to be the most economical source of supply. Joliet is applying for an allocation as a category 1B applicant. There are also several permit considerations noted on the slide. However, as a category 1B applicant, the key consideration for Joliet's permit application is reducing withdrawals from the deep aquifer. IDNR has a highly structured process for requesting a Lake Michigan water allocation. IDNR rules are spelled out in the Illinois Administrative Code. If you're interested, it's Title 17, Chapter 1, Part 3730. So specific water allocation permit requirements are listed on the slide, but include basic information on the entity, service area, and population, proposed uses for the allocation, which is domestic water supply for Joliet, description of existing and proposed water sources, and water system infrastructure. For the City of Joliet, this includes the evaluation of the water sources completed over the past 2 years, as well as a description of the 2 Lake Michigan water alternatives that the city is currently evaluating in this 2020 evaluation. Also, the entity's future water needs. This includes the water usage projections to 2050 based on anticipated population growth, as well as indicating current and proposed water conservation measures. And this is what Jeff talked about in his presentation on water conservation and non-revenue water reduction. And then, as well as any other relevant information that the applicant wants to provide to support their permit request. IDNR's Lake Michigan Water Allocation Program includes requirements that permittees must meet to help demonstrate, help Illinois demonstrate to other Great Lakes state its commitment to the efficient use and management of Lake Michigan water. So permittees are required to adopt ordinances that promote water conservation and efficiency. And like Jeff mentioned in his presentation, those have been adopted. In addition, permittees must commit to plans to reduce their level of non-revenue water to 10%. So a non-revenue water greater than 10% doesn't preclude a utility from obtaining an allocation, but if a utility's current level of non-revenue water is greater than 10%, it must submit a plan to IDNR for achieving a non-revenue water less than 10% within a specified time frame. So as Jeff mentioned, the City of Joliet's non-revenue water is greater than 10% currently, and the city has a non-revenue water reduction plan to achieve non-revenue water less than 10% by 2040, which is approximately 10 years after the city begins to use Lake Michigan water. So finally, the permittee must include a plan for discontinuation of use of the deep aquifer for normal pumpage. For Joliet, after receiving Lake Michigan water in 2030, the deep aquifer would only be used for emergency supply and would not be used for normal operation. Based on the permit information presented in the previous slides, the key permit requirements for the City of Joliet include applying as a Category 1B user to obtain Lake Michigan water and reduce withdrawals on the deep aquifer system. Also requesting Lake Michigan allocation amount based on average day demand projections to the year 2050. Implementing a plan to reduce non-revenue water below 10% by 2040, and then adopting a range of water conservation ordinances, like I said, which was completed in August. So one thing to note is that once an allocation is received, actual water usage must not be greater than 105% of the allocation over a 5-year running period, or greater than 115% of the allocation in any one allocation period. If actual water usage over the 5-year running period is less than 90%, then IDNR may require modification of the allocation. And all allocations are reviewed and adjusted approximately every 10 years. So, as mentioned previously, we're happy to announce that Joliet submitted its Lake Michigan water allocation permit application to IDNR on September 22nd, so last week, and the application is currently under review by IDNR. So, now that Joliet's application has been submitted, it'll proceed through a well-defined process of review and evaluation that's indicated on the screen. And I'm not going to go through detailed listing of this, but the key thing to note is that the final decision regarding the issuance of an allocation permit is made by the IDNR director, and that's at the last step in there. So the gold star represents where Joliet is currently in the process, with the entire process typically lasting about 6 months. So while it's near the beginning of the process, it's an important milestone for the City of Joliet in securing a new water source. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff Freeman for Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Teresa, and great job to both yourself and Joe through your portions of the presentation. As we've stated, we are moving into the questions and answers panel, and we would like as many questions that could be submitted in the chat box as well. Right now we have one question. I think there was an indication that somebody had raised their hand. We would prefer that if you could put a question into the question box so that we can address it. I'm not even sure, quite honestly, that you have audio, so we can't call on people today like would be able to do in a normal Zoom call. Just to reiterate how to put your questions into the Q&A box, if you hover over the control bar or in the portion of the screen that your Zoom setting are set up, you should be able to see a control bar. Then you want to touch the Q&A button that's on that control bar, and it should bring up a panel. Within that panel, then you want to type your question in the bottom portion of the panel, and then myself, as well as the panelist, will be able to see what question you have submitted. So go ahead, we still have time certainly to take questions. It's about 2:19 based on my clock, so we at least have a little over 10 minutes here reserved for the rest of the session. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump in. Based on the question, we'll distribute it either to myself, Allison, Joe, or Teresa. A question that has been submitted is regarding pressure management and water loss reduction, has the potential for increased intrusion, in parentheses, for instance, biological and other contamination, been evaluated if the city reduces water pressure in areas with known leaks? So essentially the pressure range, the typical pressure range for a waterworks system to operate at a point of use, like in a building, house, etc., is to operate between 35 and 80 PSI. That's the general goal. Throughout the system, you set it up into different pressure zones to try to achieve that goal. So the minimum pressure that typically a water system would operate, or a portion of a water system would operate is, around 35 psi. At that point, because it's of higher pressure, there's very limited to essentially no ability for groundwater or anything outside of the water main to get into the water main with the higher pressure. If there is a leak or an opening in that water main, it's going to push water out. Therefore, bringing it in, essentially is not of worry. The regulatory requirement is that even if the water pressure gets below 20 psi, then the city would have to go through a boil water order. So having that factor of safety by operating at 35 psi and above, which is what the city would do, even if they're going to lower the pressures in a specific district metered area, then there is not the worries related to anything getting into the water distribution system. We have another question here that has been submitted, and the question is, and I think this one's going to go to Allison, is the Southland Water Agency still being considered as a possible regional partner or supplier?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yes, the answer is yes. We are still in discussions with the Southland Water Agency. We're currently waiting for them to provide some additional information to us for us to be able to evaluate that possibility. But the answer is that we are still considering the Southland Water Agency as a component of the alternative water source program.
Okay, great. Thank you for that response, Allison. We do not currently have any other questions listed in the Q&A panel. Certainly can do that. So if somebody is typing, we'll give you one more minute here. Certainly can reach out to Allison or any of us at any time with any questions. Before we totally close it down and move on to the other slides, I'll just take this moment to mention that the recording and the slides will be available on the website tomorrow. So certainly for your reference, as well as other people's references. So if somebody is looking for them and mentions it to you, you can direct them to the Rethink Water Joliet website. All right, we do have a question here. The City of Joliet, Lake Michigan water allocation permit application, it's related to that. If the IDNR has a concern or question about Joliet's application, what effects does that have on the 6-month processing period, effect on the city's overall timeline? So I'm guessing that a number of us could probably respond to that. Is there anybody in particular that wants to?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in on this. So as I mentioned, the typical time frame is about 6 months. Yeah, if there's a question or concern in that timeline, and I don't know if you want to, Jeff, go back to that timeline. There's an opportunity for IDNR to provide comments and for then Joliet to revise and resubmit the application. So it depends on the extent of IDNR's comments and the time frame it takes for us to reply. So it's a little bit of a depends. If their comments are extensive, it could impact that 6-month time frame. But we've tried to address all the questions in our initial application. So I guess we will know more once we receive the IDNR comments on the draft application.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. So I would say we are pretty much there. We've got 5 more minutes. Don't see any more questions in the Q&A panel. Like I said, you can certainly reach out to folks if you have questions. So with that, we're just going to wrap it up and say thank you. RethinkWaterJoliet.org is the key to find the additional information, not only related to the stakeholder meeting, but there's all kinds of information on there, historical information. You can go there to see what's coming up overall as well. And then the city certainly shares information through social media. If you're not following on the social media channels and want more timely updates, let's just say, then please, reach out to the city to be able to do that. So with that, we're gonna close today's session. And once again, we really appreciate everybody taking the time to join in. On behalf of Allison, Joe, and Teresa, please have a good rest of the week.